A quiet morning disrupted. John Harris, a lively 12-year-old with a heart as bright as the morning sun, stood on the front porch of his family's modest but cheerful suburban home. He loved mornings in Maplewood, where time seemed to slow down. Birds chirped from the branches of tall oaks, and the scent of freshly cut grass wafted through the air like nature's own perfume. Rows of neat homes stretched along the quiet street, each adorned with well-maintained gardens filled with blooming flowers. Despite being relatively young, John was already known throughout the neighborhood for his warm smile and willingness to lend a hand. This morning, the warm sunlight glinted off his dark curls as he looked out at the familiar street, a basketball tucked under one arm. The rhythmic hum of lawnmowers in the distance mixed with the faint melody of wind chimes hanging from Mrs. Johnson's porch a few houses down. "John, honey, don't forget to take the trash out before you head off," his mother, Cynthia Harris, called from inside the house. "On it, Mom," John shouted back, grinning as he tossed the ball onto the porch chair. Cynthia appeared at the front door, her figure framed by morning light. She wore her crisp blue nurse's uniform, her braided hair tied back neatly. Despite the early hour and the demanding nature of her job at the local hospital, her face radiated warmth. John adored his mother. She was his rock, always managing to balance work, home, and endless love for him despite life's challenges. "What would I do without you?" she teased with a loving smile as he came up the steps to grab the trash bin. "Probably drown in garbage," John quipped, his grin wide and mischievous. Cynthia chuckled, giving him a playful swat on the shoulder. "Smart mouth," she said with mock sternness. "Now hurry before you're late for basketball practice." John laughed, grabbing the trash bin and wheeling it toward the curb. The wheels rattled against the concrete as he guided it along the driveway. The neighborhood was serene, painted in hues of gold by the rising sun. Halfway to the curb, John spotted Mrs. Johnson, their elderly neighbor, struggling to maneuver her trash bin down her porch steps. She was a sweet lady in her late 70s, always baking cookies for the neighborhood kids and telling stories about the good old days. Her hand shook slightly as she tugged at the heavy bin. Without hesitation, John jogged over, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Johnson," he offered kindly. The old woman's face brightened with relief. "Oh, bless you, John. You're such a sweetheart," she said, stepping aside. "This thing gets heavier every week, I swear." John grinned. "Maybe it's all those cookie wrappers," he joked as he easily wheeled the bin to the curb. Mrs. Johnson laughed, a sound as warm as sunshine. "You're probably right, young man. I do spoil myself sometimes." As John positioned the bin neatly next to his own, Mrs. Johnson patted his shoulder. "You've got a good heart, John. Your mama raised you right." "Thanks, Mrs. Johnson," John said earnestly. "I'll see you later." As he headed back toward his house, John caught sight of someone watching from across the street. Ms. Griffin. Perched on her pristine white porch, Ms. Griffin was the self-proclaimed neighborhood authority. She was a woman in her late 50s, always impeccably dressed in pastel sweaters and pearls, with a perfectly styled silver bob that never seemed to have a hair out of place. But behind her polished appearance lurked a cold and judgmental demeanor. John had grown used to her icy glares and whispered complaints. Ms. Griffin didn't approve of the Harris family, and she didn't bother hiding it. Ever since they had moved into the neighborhood a year ago, she had made it clear that she didn't think they fit in. John, however, refused to let her sour attitude ruin his good mood. "Good morning, Ms. Griffin," he called out cheerfully, raising a hand in greeting. Ms. Griffin's lips tightened into a thin line. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned sharply and disappeared inside her house, the door snapping shut behind her. John shrugged. "Guess someone woke up on the wrong side of the bed," he muttered to himself as he jogged back up the driveway. Cynthia, now standing by the porch with her car keys in hand, had seen the exchange. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly masked her concern with a smile. "Don't let her bother you, baby," she said gently. "I won't," John assured her, though deep down, he wondered why Ms. Griffin disliked them so much. Cynthia kissed his forehead. "That's my boy. Now go grab your ball and have fun at practice. I'll see you tonight. Bye, Mom. Love you," John called as he grabbed his basketball and headed toward the sidewalk. "Love you too, sweetheart," Cynthia said before getting into her car. As John dribbled the ball down the street, the familiar rhythm of bouncing rubber against pavement filling the air, he felt a sense of peace. Life was good, and despite the occasional scowls from Ms. Griffin, he knew he had a loving family and a supportive community. But what John didn't know was that beneath the polished facade of Maplewood, darkness was brewing. Ms. Griffin's scowl wasn't just one of disapproval, it was the prelude to a sinister plan that would soon upend John's peaceful life. As the sun continued to rise over the quiet neighborhood, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not only John's innocence, but the very fabric of justice and fairness in their community. A sinister plan unfolds. Inside her meticulously decorated home, Ms. Griffin stood by the large bay window overlooking the quiet street. The rich aroma of her freshly brewed French roast coffee filled the air, but her lips, usually painted in a conservative shade of pink, pressed into a thin, disapproving line. She watched John Harris bounce his basketball down the street, his carefree laughter echoing through the suburban calm. "That boy," she muttered to herself, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her porcelain mug. So smug, just like his mother. In truth, Ms. Griffin's disdain for the Harris family went beyond any reasonable explanation. They were everything she couldn't control. Young, vibrant, unapologetically happy, and, to her deep-seated prejudice, they simply didn't belong in her neighborhood. Maplewood, she believed, was a bastion of order, tradition, and exclusivity. When the Harrises moved in, she saw it as an affront to the carefully curated world she'd lived in for decades. Despite numerous complaints to the Homeowners Association, ranging from absurd grievances about unruly lawn care to baseless claims about excessive noise, the Harrises had proven to be nothing but model neighbors. John was beloved by many in the community, and Cynthia's work as a dedicated nurse had earned her respect. Ms. Griffin's attempts to sow discord had failed spectacularly. But now, standing in the shadows of her pristine living room, she resolved to take more drastic measures. "This time, they'll have no choice but to leave," she whispered, setting down her mug with a clink. Ms. Griffin strode over to a small walnut desk tucked neatly in the corner. From one of the polished drawers, she retrieved a leather-bound address book filled with handwritten notes and contacts dating back decades. Her manicured fingers skimmed down the pages until she found the name she was looking for: Frank O'Malley. Frank was a relic from her less-than-pure past, a man whose loyalty could be bought for the right price. He had a reputation for bending, if not outright breaking, the law. They had crossed paths years ago through a shady real estate deal that never saw the light of day, but Frank owed her a favor. Picking up the phone, Ms. Griffin dialed his number, the buttons clicking under her perfectly manicured nails. After a few rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, Frank, it's me," she said coolly. A pause. "Griffin, what do you want?" "I need a favor." Frank chuckled darkly. "You always do." "This one's simple," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I need you to plant something on a property, something that will get the cops involved." Frank's tone shifted to businesslike efficiency. "What are we talking? Drugs?" "Exactly," she confirmed, her voice devoid of hesitation. "Nothing too obvious, just enough to make it believable." There was a beat of silence on the other end before Frank spoke again. "Risky, but for the right price. You'll be well compensated," she promised. "Double your usual rate." Frank laughed grimly. "All right, Griffin, you got yourself a deal. Send me the details." Hanging up the phone, Ms. Griffin allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The wheels were now in motion. Later that night, long after the streetlights had flickered on, and the neighborhood had fallen into a peaceful slumber. Frank O'Malley crept through the shadows, his form blending seamlessly with the dark. He wore a black hoodie and gloves, moving with the stealth of someone well-versed in avoiding attention. The Harris family's backyard was quiet, illuminated faintly by the glow of the porch light. Frank made his way toward the small garden shed nestled near the back fence. The scent of flowers and freshly turned soil lingered in the cool night air, but Frank paid no mind. Pulling a small plastic bag from his pocket, he knelt by the shed door and carefully tucked the bag inside a toolbox near the entrance. The contents of the bag, a small amount of illicit drugs, were just enough to incriminate someone if found by the police. Frank stood up, dusting off his hands. "Easy money," he muttered before slipping back into the night. The next morning, unaware of the dark scheme unfolding against them, John and Cynthia went about their usual routines. John was in the front yard practicing his jump shots, while Cynthia prepared for her shift at the hospital. Laughter and the thump of the basketball filled the crisp morning air. Ms. Griffin, peering through the blinds of her living room window, dialed another number on her phone, this time to the police. "Hello, this is Maplewood Police Department," the dispatcher answered. "Yes, I need to report illegal activity at my neighbor's house," Ms. Griffin said, her voice trembling with feigned concern. "There are drugs hidden in their shed. I'm terribly frightened for the neighborhood." The dispatcher asked for more details, and Ms. Griffin provided them eagerly, painting herself as a vigilant citizen, simply trying to protect her community. "I just hope no one gets hurt," she added dramatically before ending the call. Satisfied, she leaned back against her pristine white couch, a self-satisfied smirk curling her lips. "Justice will be served," she muttered to herself, ignoring the gnawing emptiness in her chest, where a conscience should have been. Little did Ms. Griffin know, her plot was about to unravel in ways she had never anticipated, and the very community she sought to manipulate would soon rise against her with a force she couldn't control. An innocent boy framed. The bright Saturday morning was filled with the sound of bouncing basketballs and the chatter of kids enjoying a break from school. John Harris, his shoes scuffing against the pavement, laughed as he passed the ball to his best friend, Marcus Simmons. The two boys had been inseparable since John moved to Maplewood. Marcus, taller and just as competitive, dribbled expertly past John and made a flawless layup. "Man, you gotta step up your game." Marcus grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. John smirked. "Please, I was just warming up." He lunged for the ball, their laughter echoing through the quiet street. A few houses down, Ms. Griffin sat stiffly on her porch, sipping from a teacup. Her eyes narrowed as she watched John and Marcus play. Even on this picturesque morning, her mind churned with thoughts of her carefully crafted scheme. Everything had been set in motion. Frank O'Malley had done his part, and the call to the police had been made. Now all she had to do was wait, and waiting wouldn't take long. The sudden screech of tires shattered the peaceful atmosphere. Two black and white police cars came speeding down the street, their sirens off but lights flashing ominously. The joyful sounds of children playing halted abruptly as neighbors peeked from behind curtains and front porches, their faces etched with concern. John froze, the basketball rolling forgotten into the street. His mother, Cynthia, had just stepped out onto the porch to remind him to hydrate when her eyes widened at the sight of the approaching officers. "What on earth?" she whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. The police cars came to a halt in front of the Harris house, doors swinging open as two uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions grim. "Can I help you, officers?" Cynthia called, trying to keep her voice steady despite the sudden wave of anxiety gripping her chest. "Ma'am," one officer said, "we received an anonymous tip regarding illegal substances on your property. We need to search the premises, including your shed." Cynthia blinked, stunned. "Illegal substances? That's absurd. There's nothing like that here." "Standard procedure, Mom," the officer insisted. "You can give us permission, or we can obtain a warrant." Neighbors began to gather on their lawns, whispers spreading like wildfire through the crowd. John stepped closer to his mother, his heart racing. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, his voice cracking with confusion. "It's a mistake, baby," Cynthia said, wrapping an arm protectively around him. "Just a mistake." Reluctantly, she nodded to the officers. "Go ahead. We have nothing to hide." The officers moved swiftly toward the backyard, their boots crunching against the gravel path. Cynthia clenched her fists, silently praying this nightmare would end as quickly as it began. Minutes later, the officers emerged from the shed, one of them holding a small clear plastic bag filled with white powder. The air seemed to thicken with tension. "This was found in your shed," the officer announced grimly, holding up the evidence. "That's impossible," Cynthia cried, stepping forward. "Someone must have put that there. It's not ours." John's stomach twisted into knots. He had never even seen drugs in real life, let alone hidden them in his own backyard. The officer turned to John, his expression hardening. "Son, do you know anything about this?" John's voice wavered as he spoke. "No, sir. I swear I don't. I've never seen that before." Despite his protests, the officer pulled handcuffs from his belt. "We need to take you down to the station for questioning," he said firmly. "What?" Cynthia gasped, stepping between her son and the officer. "He's a child. This is a mistake. He's never been in trouble a day in his life." "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have to follow protocol," the officer said, his tone cold but unwavering. Tears welled up in Cynthia's eyes as John was handcuffed in front of their neighbors. "Mom, I didn't do anything," John cried, his voice thick with panic. "I know, baby. I know," Cynthia sobbed, her heart breaking at the sight of her son being treated like a criminal. The neighbors watched in stunned silence. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman John had helped just days ago, clutched her chest in disbelief. "This can't be right," she whispered to herself. "That boy is innocent." As John was led toward the police car, Marcus shouted from the sidewalk, "John didn't do anything. Y'all got the wrong person." The officer ignored him, pushing John gently but firmly into the back seat. Ms. Griffin stood on her porch, a triumphant gleam in her eyes hidden behind a mask of feigned shock. "Oh my," she murmured to a neighbor standing nearby. "I always suspected there was something off about that family. Such a shame." The neighbor shot her a disapproving glance. "John's a good boy," she said firmly. "I don't believe this for a second." But Ms. Griffin's seeds of doubt had already been planted. At the police station, Detective Sarah Reynolds, a sharp-minded officer with a reputation for thorough investigations, reviewed the preliminary report on John's case. Something about it didn't sit right with her. Anonymous tip, drugs found in the shed of a 12-year-old boy with a spotless record. She muttered to herself, "Doesn't add up." She glanced at John, who sat in the interrogation room with red-rimmed eyes, visibly shaken. His mother sat beside him, her hand firmly clasping his. Reynolds tapped her pen thoughtfully against the desk. "I've seen setups before," she murmured. "This smells like one." Determined to get to the bottom of it, Reynolds stood up, her jaw set with resolve. She wasn't about to let an innocent child's life be ruined by a lie. What Detective Reynolds didn't know yet was that unraveling the truth would expose not just a petty grudge, but a dark and tangled web of deceit that went deeper than anyone in Maplewood could have imagined. And at the center of it all stood Ms. Griffin, who was about to learn that even the best laid plans have consequences. Seeds of doubt and sparks of justice. The sterile walls of the Maplewood Police Department were lined with bulletin boards filled with case files and wanted posters. The hum of ringing phones and clacking keyboards filled the air. In one of the small interrogation rooms, John Harris sat stiffly on a metal chair, his wrists raw from the handcuffs that had only recently been removed. Beside him, Cynthia held her son's hand tightly, her expression a mix of fierce protectiveness and simmering rage. Detective Sarah Reynolds stood across from them, a folder in her hands. Her sharp eyes, framed by dark curls tucked behind her ears, flicked back and forth between John's anxious face and the file in front of her. Mrs. Harris, Reynolds began, her voice steady but kind. I want you to know that I'm taking this case seriously, but I need to ask some tough questions. Cynthia nodded, though her grip on John's hand tightened. We have nothing to hide, Detective. My son is innocent. John's voice wavered. I swear, I didn't do anything. I've never even seen drugs before. Reynolds sat down across from them, folding her hands on the table. I believe you, John, she said gently, but I need to figure out how those drugs ended up in your shed. Someone went through a lot of trouble to put you in this position. Cynthia's jaw clenched. It was planted. I know it. Someone's trying to frame us. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. That's my theory too, but I'll need evidence to prove it. John's voice broke through the tension. Do you think it was Ms. Griffin? Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Ms. Griffin, your neighbor. Cynthia scoffed bitterly. She's hated us since the day we moved in. Always complaining, always watching us like we don't belong there. If anyone has a motive, it's her. Reynolds leaned back, tapping her pen against the table. Interesting. Has she ever made direct threats? Not outright, Cynthia admitted, but plenty of passive-aggressive comments. She's not exactly subtle. Reynolds made a note in her pad. We'll look into it. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, whispers spread like wildfire. The arrest of young John Harris had become the talk of Maplewood. Many neighbors who had known John as a helpful and kind boy found it hard to believe the allegations against him. Mrs. Johnson, who had been watching everything unfold from her porch, was particularly upset. The frail woman, leaning heavily on her cane, hobbled over to a small group of neighbors gathered by the mailbox. This is a disgrace, she said, her voice trembling with anger. That boy is innocent. I saw him just the other day helping me with my trash. You think a child like that is out dealing drugs? Nonsense. I agree, said Mr. Patel, a retired schoolteacher. John's one of the most respectful kids I've ever met. Something doesn't add up here. It's that Griffin woman, Mrs. Johnson hissed, her voice low but fierce. She's had it out for the Harris family since they moved in. I wouldn't put it past her to be behind this. The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. What can we do? Mr. Patel asked. The police are involved now. It's out of our hands. Mrs. Johnson's eyes gleamed with determination. We can speak the truth. If enough of us stand up for John, maybe the police will listen. Back at the station, Reynolds received a knock on her office door. It was Officer Morales, holding a small evidence bag. Detective, Morales said, I think you'll want to see this. Reynolds took the bag and examined it closely. Inside was a fingerprint report from the drugs found in the Harris shed. No prints from John or Cynthia, Morales explained, but we did find partials from someone else. Who? Reynolds asked sharply. Frank O'Malley, Morales confirmed. Reynolds frowned. The name was familiar. O'Malley had a history of petty crimes, including burglary and drug possession. He was a known associate of shady figures in Maplewood. Why would O'Malley be anywhere near the Harris property? Reynolds muttered, her mind racing. Morales shrugged. That's what we need to find out. Reynolds stood up, her resolve hardening. Time to pay Mr. O'Malley a visit. Later that afternoon, Reynolds and Morales pulled up to a rundown house on the outskirts of town. The lawn was overgrown, and the paint on the shutters was peeling. A rusted pickup truck sat in the driveway. Reynolds knocked firmly on the door. After a moment, it creaked open to reveal Frank O'Malley, his face rough and weathered from years of hard living. What do you want? He growled. Reynolds held up her badge. Detective Reynolds, Maplewood PD. We need to ask you a few questions about a case involving the Harris family. O'Malley's expression flickered with unease. Don't know nothing about it, he said gruffly, starting to close the door. Reynolds planted her foot firmly against it. Funny, because your fingerprints were found on an evidence bag recovered from their property. O'Malley's face paled. Look, I was just doing a favor for someone, all right. Who? Reynolds demanded. O'Malley hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. "Griffin," he finally muttered. "That uptight lady from Maplewood. She paid me to plant the stuff in their shed." Reynolds exchanged a glance with Morales. "You willing to make a statement?" O'Malley sighed heavily. "Guess I don't got much choice, do I?" The next day, Detective Reynolds stood in front of the Harris family's home, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She had just wrapped up a conversation with the DA, who was preparing to drop all charges against John. Cynthia, her eyes filled with gratitude, hugged Reynolds tightly. "Thank you, Detective. You saved my son's life." John, standing beside his mother, looked up at Reynolds. "Does this mean it's over?" "Almost," Reynolds promised. "We still need to deal with Ms. Griffin. But trust me, John, you're going to be just fine." As neighbors gathered around, clapping and offering words of support, Ms. Griffin watched from her porch, her face pale and tight with fury. Justice was coming for her, and this time, there was nowhere to hide. The neighborhood strikes back. A tense hush had settled over the usually cheerful streets of Maplewood. The scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air, but gone were the carefree sounds of laughter and bouncing basketballs. The arrest of John Harris weighed heavily on the hearts of neighbors who knew the boy's innocence and questioned how such injustice had wormed its way into their peaceful community. And at the center of it all, like a festering wound, sat Ms. Griffin. She remained on her porch most afternoons, observing the neighborhood with narrowed eyes. She no longer wore the triumphant smirk from the day John was taken into custody. Instead, her face was tight, lips pressed into a grim line. Though she'd succeeded in having the Harris family publicly humiliated, something gnawed at her. Frank O'Malley's involvement hadn't been part of the original plan. He was supposed to disappear quietly after planting the drugs, but now he was cooperating with the police. Ms. Griffin knew it was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light. Still, she clung stubbornly to her pride. "This neighborhood needs to be kept in order," she muttered under her breath, sipping her bitter black coffee. But Ms. Griffin was no longer the puppet master. The strings of control had slipped from her hands, and the community was rallying behind the Harris family with a force she hadn't anticipated. Detective Sarah Reynolds returned to Maplewood with a warrant in hand. After Frank O'Malley's signed confession, the DA had greenlit an investigation into Ms. Griffin's involvement in the framing of John Harris. Reynolds knew that Ms. Griffin's polished reputation would be no shield against the weight of the evidence. "Ready, Morales?" Reynolds asked as they parked near the Harris home. "More than ready," Morales replied grimly. The two officers strode toward Ms. Griffin's house, their boots crunching against the gravel path. Several neighbors watched from their porches, murmuring among themselves. Mrs. Johnson, leaning heavily on her cane, gave the detectives an approving nod. "It's about time," she muttered. Reynolds knocked firmly on Ms. Griffin's door. After a moment of tense silence, the door creaked open, revealing Ms. Griffin in her crisp beige cardigan and pearl earrings. "Detective," she greeted coolly, though there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "To what do I owe this visit?" "We have a warrant to search your property, Ms. Griffin," Reynolds said evenly, holding up the document. "We also need to ask you some questions about your involvement in the recent incident involving the Harris family." Ms. Griffin's carefully curated facade cracked. "This is outrageous," she hissed. "I've done nothing wrong." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Reynolds said calmly. "Step aside, please." Reluctantly, Ms. Griffin moved out of the way, her face flushed with indignation. As the officers searched the house, neighbors gathered on the street, murmuring with a mix of curiosity and satisfaction. Cynthia Harris stood among them, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. John stood by her side, his expression wary but hopeful. "Do you think they'll find anything?" Marcus whispered, standing next to John. John shrugged, his voice low. "I don't know, man. I just want this nightmare to be over." Inside Ms. Griffin's pristine living room, Morales rifled through drawers and cabinets, while Reynolds methodically examined a desk cluttered with handwritten notes. "Bingo," Morales called out, holding up a small leather-bound ledger. Reynolds flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing as she read the entries. It was a detailed record of payments Ms. Griffin had made to Frank O'Malley, including dates and amounts corresponding perfectly with the timeline of the planted drugs incident. "Gotcha," Reynolds muttered under her breath. Turning to Ms. Griffin, who stood rigidly by the doorway, Reynolds held up the ledger. "Care to explain this?" Ms. Griffin's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I have no idea what that is," she stammered. "Frank O'Malley already confessed," Reynolds said, her tone sharp. "And this ledger just sealed your fate." As Ms. Griffin was escorted out of her home in handcuffs, the neighborhood erupted into murmurs of shock and satisfaction. Cynthia watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Finally, she whispered. Mrs. Johnson, never one to mince words, hobbled over to Cynthia. "Justice, dear. It took its time, but it came." John, still processing the surreal sight of Ms. Griffin being arrested, asked, "Does this mean we're safe now?" Cynthia pulled her son into a tight embrace. "Yes, baby, we're safe." The officers led Ms. Griffin to the squad car, her face pale and expressionless. As the car door slammed shut, a sense of closure washed over the crowd. In the days that followed, the community of Maplewood rallied around the Harris family. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance came forward with gestures of support, bringing meals, offering help with yard work, and organizing a petition to formally clear John's name. Detective Reynolds ensured that the charges against John were expunged from his record, and the DA publicly issued a statement acknowledging the injustice he had faced. The Harrises, once seen as outsiders, had become a symbol of resilience and unity. On a sunny afternoon, John stood on the basketball court with Marcus, shooting hoops as life returned to normal. "You know what?" Marcus said, passing John the ball. "You're like a neighborhood hero now." John laughed, the weight of the past weeks lifting from his chest. "I don't know about that. I'm just glad it's over." As the ball swished through the hoop, Mrs. Johnson clapped from her porch. "Attaboy, John." Life in Maplewood had changed. And though scars remained, the community had learned a valuable lesson about justice, prejudice, and standing up for what was right. And for John Harris, it was a fresh start, a chance to keep being the kind-hearted boy who had always believed in doing the right thing, no matter the odds. A new dawn in Maplewood. The golden light of dawn spread across Maplewood, casting long shadows over neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds in full bloom. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of morning dew. For the Harris family, this morning marked not just a new day, but a new beginning. After weeks of turmoil, things were finally settling down. The charges against John had been dismissed. Ms. Griffin had been formally charged with multiple offenses including conspiracy and perjury, and the community had come together in an unexpected show of unity. Still, the events of recent weeks lingered like a fading bruise, a reminder of how quickly prejudice and malice could upend lives. Cynthia stood at the kitchen window, watching John and Marcus play basketball in the driveway. The sound of the ball bouncing against the pavement was comforting. Normal. "I'll never take that sound for granted again," she muttered to herself, sipping her coffee. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Cynthia set down her mug and opened the door to find Detective Sarah Reynolds standing on the porch, her professional demeanor softened by a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Harris," Reynolds greeted. "Detective," Cynthia said, stepping aside to let her in. "Please, come in." Reynolds entered, glancing around at the cozy home. "I just wanted to stop by and give you an update. The DA's office has everything they need to prosecute Ms. Griffin. With O'Malley's statement and the evidence we found, it's a pretty airtight case." Cynthia nodded, relief washing over her. "That's good to hear. I just want this whole thing behind us." Reynolds smiled. "It's almost there. I also wanted to let you know the department is expunging John's record completely. There won't be any lasting mark from this." Tears welled up in Cynthia's eyes. "Thank you, Detective. For everything. You believed us when no one else did. Reynolds shook her head. John didn't deserve what happened to him. I just did my job. Cynthia gave her a grateful look. Well, you did a damn good job. Outside, John dribbled past Marcus and went for a layup. The ball swished through the net. Man, you've been practicing. Marcus laughed, clapping John on the back. You know it, John grinned. No distractions now. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. It's crazy how everything turned out, huh? I mean, Ms. Griffin getting arrested and all that. Never thought I'd see it. John's smile faded slightly. Yeah, I still can't believe she hated us that much. She's gone now, though, Marcus said reassuringly, and everyone knows the truth. You're a hero, man. John shook his head. I'm not a hero. I just didn't give up. Marcus grinned. Same thing, bro. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mrs. Johnson, leaning on her cane, made her way toward them with a determined glint in her eye. Good morning, boys, she greeted, her voice strong despite her age. Hey, Mrs. Johnson, John said cheerfully. I just wanted to say something, she said, her gaze settling firmly on John. I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've seen a lot. But you, young man, you've shown more strength and grace than most adults I know. John blushed. Thanks, Mrs. Johnson. She wagged a finger at him. Don't you let anyone tell you different, and if anyone gives you trouble, you just send them my way. John and Marcus laughed, the tension lifting. Later that afternoon, the neighborhood gathered for a block party, a spontaneous celebration of unity and healing. Tables lined the street, covered with plates of fried chicken, fresh salads, and trays of baked goods. Children played games while adults mingled, sharing stories and laughter. The Harrises were at the center of it all, surrounded by neighbors offering apologies, support, and heartfelt thanks. You know, Mr. Paddle said, shaking John's hand, you taught this neighborhood something important, young man. Standing up for yourself, even when it's hard. That's real courage. Thanks, Mr. Patel, John said shyly. Cynthia watched proudly as her son interacted with the neighbors. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. Detective Reynolds appeared beside her, holding a soda can. Quite the turnout, she remarked. Yeah, Cynthia agreed, smiling. It's nice to see people coming together after everything. Reynolds nodded. You've got a good community here, and a remarkable son. Cynthia's eyes glistened with emotion. He's always been remarkable. I'm just glad everyone else sees it now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, John stood on the edge of the party, taking it all in. The weight that had pressed down on him since his arrest had finally lifted. Marcus joined him, nudging his shoulder. You good man. Yeah, John said, smiling softly. I think I am. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Marcus grinned mischievously. So, rematch tomorrow. John laughed. You know it. As the neighborhood continued to celebrate, John knew that life would never be the same, but it would be better, stronger, because no matter how dark things had gotten, he had held on to hope. And hope, he realized, was the most powerful thing of all. The future was bright, and John Harris was ready for it.